The American dream, home ownership. And where did Americans in the early 20th century look to achieve that dream? The suburbs, the frontier of the city. The suburbs not only offered an escape from overcrowded, unsanitary cities, but the opportunity to embrace a new living experience. While that opportunity was promptly delivered to white residents, it was swiftly denied to African Americans. And for this reason, Richmond, Virginia's Northside suburbs became a battleground for segregation. After the Civil War, the north side of Richmond beckoned wealthy investors to secure hundreds of acres for development. This region emerged as a frontier where expansion was perceived as the threshold of the future. One such wealthy investor was Lewis Ginter, a tobacco magnate whose Allen & Ginter factory employed thousands of Richmonders. In 1888, Ginter toured Melbourne, Australia, where he was inspired by the suburban lifestyle its residents embraced. Upon his return to Richmond, he implemented his vision of a rural retreat by acquiring land in northern Henrico County. He joined forces with John Pope, his close companion of 15 years, and Joseph Bryan, a fellow industrialist and founder of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. By 1889, he had purchased 52 land acquisitions that would comprise the present-day Northside district, later becoming the neighborhoods of Ginter Park, Sherwood Park, and Bellevue. He formed the Sherwood Land Company in 1891 to secure more land and engaged the leading landscape architect of his day, Frederick Law Olmsted, to transform his neighborhoods into a suburban haven. Construction began on single-family homes built along roadways with sewer lines. As director of the Richmond Locomotive and Machine Works, Ginter developed a narrow-gauge railway that supplied crushed stone from his quarries on Hermitage Road to provide streets with enhanced surfaces. He extended the Richmond Union Passenger Railway to his neighborhoods, bringing the first electric-powered transit system to the suburbs. With streetcars, Northside residents could commute to the city in 15 minutes. The Northside and Ginter's vision embodied the frontier of housing. Ginter died in 1897, and upon his death, the Northside fell into new hands. Ginter's heirs included an assortment of relatives and business partners who continued to carry out his vision of a suburban retreat, and as a result, the Northside became defined by race. Ginter intended to keep nearby African American populations out of the Northside, and when the neighborhood came into the possession of developers and real estate agents, they swiftly enacted his plans. Advertisements were printed in the Richmond Times-Dispatch proclaiming the suburbs as an idealistic community with refined residents. In a publication issued by realtors, Suburban Reflections, the agents claimed that members of the Caucasian race shall have the exclusive privilege of buying. It wasn't long before legislation backed this frontier of housing segregation. During Reconstruction, Richmond was not a segregated city. But by 1911, Richmond began charting a new course toward greater inequality. In April of that year, the City Council adopted a zoning ordinance that barred African Americans from inhabiting white neighborhoods. And on March 12, 1912, the Virginia General Assembly permitted all cities and towns to adopt residential segregation ordinances. But the U.S. Supreme Court thought otherwise. In the 1917 case, Buchanan v. Warley, they ruled that these ordinances were unconstitutional. Richmond swiftly adopted an alternative by 1929. Based on Walter Plecker's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, Richmond adopted an ordinance that prohibited a person from living in a neighborhood where they were not permitted to marry any member of the majority population. But within less than a year, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals deemed the ordinance unconstitutional. It seemed the frontier could never be segregated through government policy. Until Richmond met Wall Street. In 1929, the nation experienced the most devastating stock market crash in its history, sending the country spiraling into the Great Depression. In 1933, upon his ascent to the presidency, Franklin D. Roosevelt formed the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which aimed to refinance home mortgages currently in default to prevent foreclosure. Its purpose to expand opportunity for homeowners was perceived as a swift step toward national financial stability. As part of the New Deal, the HOLC intended to provide relief for families whose fortunes had vanished during the Depression. But by design, it unleashed a systematic divergence that scarred American cities. Redlining. In this policy, creditworthy applicants for housing loans were denied those loans regardless of their eligibility. The HOLC created maps of the city which redlined entire neighborhoods, essentially separating African Americans from whites. It compiled reports of neighborhoods, rating each on a scale from A to D in accordance with the principal race in those districts. While it was not the only factor affecting a neighborhood's grade, it was heavily weighed among the others as a determining reason why a certain neighborhood should be deemed precarious for granting a home loan. Bellevue and Ginter Park were rated as B-grade neighborhoods because of their proximity to the redlined Washington Park, an African American community. Sherwood Park received an A grade because of its distance from these neighborhoods. Now, Ginter's vision of a racially segregated Northside had become a reality. But social critics condemned this vision. Fervid preservationist Mary Wingfield Scott advocated for a fair division of decent places to live for whites and African Americans, recognizing that nothing creates worse race relations than inequitable exploitation of housing space. Redlining was outlawed in 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. But housing segregation would live on, further dividing Richmond. The construction of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike isolated neighborhoods according to race, displacing residents of Jackson Ward, a thriving African American community once known as the Black Wall Street of America. Well, the 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, deemed that state laws that segregated public schools were unconstitutional. Resistance emerged where these measures were practiced and enforced for decades. Housing segregation remains at the center of political and societal discourse, with many trying to understand its influence on American culture and how that legacy has shaped cities across the nation. But the link between housing segregation and suburban life cannot be severed, because it was frontiers like the Northside that influenced the destiny of the city. Without this frontier, Richmond couldn't have expanded, but at the same time it attracted developers steering it down the path of inequality, of a segregated future that proved to be the tragedy of its very existence. What promised to be the frontier of opportunity proved only to divide.